I was the black sheep of the family, but my grandparents left me the house valued at $1.2 million over my perfect gloating cousin, and the house, valued at $1.2 million, had been in our family for nearly a century. Built by my great-grandfather in the early 1900s, it was a sprawling two-story craftsman with a wraparound porch and original hardwood floors. Each room held traces of family history, worn photo albums on shelves, the faint scent of my grandmother's lavender perfume, and walls lined with generations of portraits. It was more than property. It was the heart of our family legacy, filled with stories, secrets, and memories that span decades. So, here's the story. I grew up in a family that always made me feel like an outsider. It's not that they were outright mean to me, but it was clear I wasn't like the rest of them. My cousin Madison was a huge part of that feeling. While I was the quiet kid, she was the one everyone seemed to adore. Madison and I are close in age, just 2 years apart, but it felt like she was light years ahead of me in everyone's eyes. Madison was always the one with the gold stars, the perfect grades, the loud laugh that drew everyone's attention. I was the kid who faded into the background, the quiet and sensitive one. And Madison made sure I felt that gap. She'd pull little pranks, like pulling my chair out from under me or telling stories that made me look bad to the rest of the family. If I complained or tried to stand up for myself, I'd get scolded for making a fuss. It was always somehow my fault. The family loved her. They praised her at every gathering, always amazed by whatever new thing she was doing. It didn't matter what I did. She was the one everyone noticed. I tried hard to fit in, to make them proud, but it seemed like nothing I did was enough. Even my grandparents, who I was closest to, treated her like she was someone special. They'd give me small, kind moments when it was just us, but in a family setting, Madison was the star. When I turned 18, I decided to get some distance. I left for college and built a life away from them. I made friends, found a career I enjoyed, and finally felt like I wasn't living in Madison's shadow. I rarely went back home, just for the occasional holiday or big family event. I'd show up, keep my head down, and then leave as soon as I could. The less time around Madison and the rest, the better. Then, a few months ago, my grandparents passed away. Coming home for their funeral was tough. Seeing everyone in that same old house brought back all those memories of feeling like the odd one out. Madison was there, of course, front and center. She played the perfect grieving granddaughter, putting on a show for everyone. The family circled around her, comforting her like she was the only one who mattered. It stung, even though I told myself I didn't care anymore. I wasn't expecting much from the will reading. To be honest, I didn't think I'd get anything at all. I figured it would all go to Madison. She'd always been the family's favorite, and I assumed my grandparents would just leave me a keepsake or something small. I didn't have high hopes, but I went out of respect. When we all gathered for the reading, I could see Madison practically glowing. She was so sure everything was about to go her way, like usual. The rest of the family sat around her, nodding and whispering, glancing at me with that familiar look of polite indifference. Then, the lawyer read out the will. And what he said was like a punch to everyone in the room, especially Madison. My grandparents had left me the family house. The house wasn't just any house. It was a huge, old place that had been in the family for generations. It was the house where all the holidays, reunions, and parties took place. The house where my grandparents had lived their whole lives. Madison's face went white, and the room went so silent you could hear a pin drop. The lawyer explained that my grandparents had chosen me because they wanted me to have a place to feel at home, somewhere that truly belonged to me. It was like they'd seen something in me that I never realized, and for the first time, I felt like maybe they'd understood what it was like to feel out of place in the family. Madison didn't take it well. She started making a scene, saying there must have been a mistake. She said I must have manipulated them somehow, that I didn't deserve the house. Her face turned red, and she looked like she was ready to explode. The family watched, uncomfortable and unsure of what to say. I sat there in shock, barely able to process what was happening. All those years of feeling like I wasn't good enough, like I didn't belong, and now this. The house was mine. As the news spread through the family, I got a mix of reactions. Some people congratulated me quietly, but most of them looked annoyed. like they were just waiting for Madison to take back what they thought was hers. She was already plotting ways to contest the will, saying she'd make sure the house ended up in her hands. It was clear she wasn't going to let this go easily. And just like that, I'd gone from the forgotten kid to the center of a family fight. After the reading of the will, things got tense fast. Madison's reaction was intense, like, way more than I expected. I knew she'd be mad, but she was almost frantic, insisting it wasn't right, that I'd somehow tricked our grandparents. The lawyer had barely closed his briefcase before Madison pulled me aside, her eyes wild and red from tears. "You don't deserve this," she hissed, gripping my arm so hard it hurt. "Everyone knows that house should be mine. I spent years with them. Years. They loved me. Why would they give it to you?" I was stunned, speechless. She was right that she'd always been the one they doted on. But in this moment, I saw something different in her. It wasn't just anger. It was desperation. I tried to shake her off, telling her it wasn't my choice. But that didn't do much to calm her down. "You manipulated them," she said, her voice low but trembling with fury. "I'm going to fight this. I'll get it back." I didn't even have the energy to respond. For once, I'd been given something that was just for me. It felt unreal, like I'd been handed a gift I'd never even known I wanted, and she was already trying to take it away. She stormed off, and the rest of the family looked at me with that same mix of confusion and suspicion. I could almost hear their thoughts. Why would they leave it to him? After the reading, I spent a few days in the house alone. It felt strange, like I was visiting a piece of history that didn't quite belong to me. The place was huge, with old-fashioned furniture and portraits of long-dead relatives staring down from the walls. Every room felt like a snapshot of my grandparents' lives. The creaky floors, the smell of old wood and books. It was comforting and eerie at the same time, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was somehow intruding, even though the house was technically mine now. Madison, true to her word, didn't waste time before getting the family involved. She started calling everyone, telling them how unfair it was, saying that I'd somehow taken advantage of our grandparents. Some family members called me, hinting that maybe I should consider doing the right thing and giving her the house. My aunt, Madison's mother, actually told me that she was sure my grandparents would have wanted Madison to have it and that maybe they'd been confused when they wrote the will. It was exhausting. Every day brought new calls and messages, more people trying to convince me that I didn't deserve what was left to me. Part of me started to wonder if they were right, if maybe there had been some mistake. I knew I wasn't the favorite. I'd known that all my life. Why had my grandparents chosen me? One night, as I was wandering through the house, I found myself in the attic. It was dusty and filled with old trunks, boxes, and random family relics. I started going through a few boxes, just to distract myself. In one of them, tucked away under old photos and knickknacks, I found a journal. The cover was faded, and the pages were yellowed with age, but I recognized the handwriting immediately. It was my grandmother's. Reading her words was like hearing her voice again. She wrote about everyday things at first, notes about the garden, favorite recipes, the little things that made up her days. But as I flipped further, her entries became more personal. She wrote about the family, and to my shock, she even wrote about Madison and me. She described Madison as a bright, clever child, but she also hinted at something deeper, something less flattering. My grandmother noted that Madison seemed to be too focused on appearances and that she worried about the way she treated me. She mentioned a few incidents I'd long forgotten, small things where Madison had been cruel or manipulative. My grandmother had noticed, even if she never spoke about it. She wrote that she saw herself in me, that she had also felt like an outsider in her own family once upon a time. I sat there, stunned, rereading those passages. I never thought anyone in my family had really noticed me, let alone understood how it felt to be the odd one out. It was like my grandmother had left these words for me, a message from the past that I'd stumbled upon at exactly the right moment. I felt this new sense of clarity, like for once I didn't have to justify myself or explain why I was worthy. My grandmother had seen it, and that was enough. But as comforting as that was, it didn't change the fact that Madison was gunning for the house. She made her intentions clear by filing a formal contest with the family lawyer, claiming that the will was invalid due to undue influence. It was ridiculous. But she was determined, and with our family's history of taking her side, I wasn't sure I'd have any support. A few days later, Madison showed up at the house. She walked right in without knocking, looking around like she was already planning her redecorating. When she saw me, her face hardened. "I don't know what game you're playing, but it's not going to work," she said. "You don't belong here, Liam. You never have." It hurt more than I'd like to admit. I didn't know why she felt so entitled to the house, but it was clear she'd do whatever it took to get it. I just stood there, trying to stay calm, and told her that my grandmother had chosen me for a reason, and that I intended to honor that. She scoffed. "Honor? You're not honoring anyone by squatting in a place that was never meant for you." With that, she stormed out, leaving me standing there, feeling like I'd been punched. But for the first time in my life, I wasn't backing down. My grandmother's words had given me a strange kind of strength, a reminder that I wasn't as invisible as I'd always felt. I didn't know how things would turn out, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to let Madison push me around anymore. The days that followed Madison's visit were intense. I was trying to adjust to my new life in the house, but the pressure from my family made it impossible to settle in. Madison didn't just give up after our last conversation. She doubled down. She called a few relatives, spreading rumors that I'd somehow convinced our grandparents to change the will in my favor. She claimed I'd manipulated them, which was ridiculous, but people were quick to believe her. I started getting calls from family members urging me to do the right thing and give Madison the house. Some were subtle, hinting that it was only fair for her to have it, while others were more direct, accusing me of trying to steal what belonged to her. I'd never felt such pressure before. Part of me just wanted to give in, to keep the peace and go back to my old, quiet life. But my grandmother's words in that journal kept coming back to me, reminding me of her faith in me, the sense that I deserved something that was truly mine. One evening, I decided to dig deeper into the journal. I couldn't shake the feeling that my grandmother had left it for me on purpose, like she knew I'd find it when I needed it most. As I flipped through the pages, I came across an entry that surprised me. She wrote about Madison's behavior as a teenager, how she'd noticed Madison becoming increasingly controlling and competitive. My grandmother hinted that she'd seen Madison's darker side, and she worried about how it might affect the family in the long run. There was one entry, in particular, that struck me. My grandmother wrote, "I'm leaving the house to Liam because he needs a place to feel he belongs. He has a good heart, something this family often overlooks. Madison may shine brighter, but I hope he knows that quiet strength matters too." Reading those words brought a lump to my throat. All my life, I'd felt overlooked, like I didn't belong. And here, in my grandmother's own handwriting, was proof that she'd seen something in me worth believing in. For the first time, I didn't feel like I had to justify myself to anyone. But Madison wasn't giving up. She started looking into legal ways to contest the will. I knew she didn't have much ground to stand on. My grandparents had been of sound mind when they wrote it, and I hadn't influenced them at all. But she was determined to make my life difficult. She even began spreading lies about me to other relatives, claiming I was only interested in the house for the money, that I planned to sell it and abandon the family. It was exhausting, and soon I felt like everyone was looking at me with suspicion. One afternoon, I got a call from my aunt, Madison's mother. She invited me to her house to talk things over. I wasn't sure what to expect, but I figured I might as well go and see if I could set things straight. When I arrived, she greeted me with a forced smile. We sat down, and she wasted no time getting to the point. "Liam," she started, "I think you know how much this house means to Madison. She's been part of the family in ways that, well, I'm sure you understand." I knew what she was implying. Madison had always been the center of attention, the one everyone doted on. I'd been the quiet kid, the one who wasn't as involved. But I didn't let her words shake me. "I understand that, but Grandma and Grandpa left it to me for a reason," I said calmly. "They wanted me to have a place where I belonged." My aunt's face tightened. Madison has always dreamed of living there. She even talked about raising her own family there one day. Can't you see how much it would mean to her? I wanted to scream. The house was my inheritance, the one thing my grandparents had left specifically to me, yet here I was being asked to give it up for the family favorite. I tried to be polite, but firm. I know it's hard for everyone to accept, but this was their choice. They wrote it in the will. I'm just honoring what they wanted. My aunt sighed, clearly frustrated. She looked at me like I was the one being difficult, refusing to see reason. Liam, don't you think you're being a bit selfish? That word hit me hard. Selfish. All my life, I'd felt like the one making compromises, the one who was left out. And now, for the first time, I'd been given something truly meaningful, and they were calling me selfish for wanting to keep it. I took a deep breath, trying not to lose my cool. No, I don't think I'm being selfish, I replied. I think I'm finally standing up for myself. Grandma wanted me to have the house. I'm going to respect that. The conversation ended on a cold note, with my aunt telling me that she hoped I'd reconsider. I knew what she really meant, that she'd keep pushing until I gave in, but I didn't plan on backing down. That night, I went back to the journal and found another entry that caught my attention. This one was different, almost like my grandmother was speaking directly to me. She wrote about her own struggles as a young woman in the family, how she'd felt out of place and how she'd been pressured to fit into a mold she didn't belong in. She mentioned that the house had been her sanctuary, her escape from the expectations that weighed on her. I hope that one day, Liam will find his own sanctuary here, she wrote. This house should belong to someone who truly values it, not for status, but for the sense of home it offers. Her words were like a shield against all the pressure I was facing. They reminded me that I wasn't fighting for the house just for myself. I was honoring her legacy and the peace she'd found here. It gave me the courage to keep pushing back against Madison and anyone else who thought they could force me to give it up. Over the next few days, Madison's tactics got bolder. She started showing up at the house unannounced, inspecting every room, trying to assert her claim. She'd act like she was just visiting, but it was clear she was scoping out the place, looking for anything she could use to undermine me. I began locking the doors just to keep her out, but she'd still find ways to leave her mark, sometimes by leaving little notes around the house, reminding me that I was intruding in her space. The more she pushed, the more I felt my resolve harden. I wasn't the weak, quiet kid she could push around anymore. This house was mine, and I was ready to fight for it, even if that meant facing down my entire family. I didn't know where this was all headed, but I knew one thing. I wasn't going to let Madison take away the one thing that finally made me feel like I belonged. The constant pressure from Madison and the family was taking a toll. I was trying to stand my ground, but each day brought a new message or phone call. Madison's persistence was unmatched. If she couldn't wear me down by spreading rumors, she'd try to find other ways to make my life difficult. And I knew she wasn't stopping anytime soon. She was obsessed, convinced the house was hers, and nothing would make her back off. One evening, I was in the attic, escaping the chaos and looking for more pieces of my grandmother's past in that old journal. Her words had been the only thing keeping me anchored, giving me a sense of purpose. But as I flipped through the pages, I found something that caught me completely off guard. The entry wasn't just about Madison and me this time. My grandmother wrote about her struggles with the family's expectations and a deep, dark family secret that I had never known. She hinted at a side of the family that had been swept under the rug, things no one ever talked about, and she was careful with her words, like she didn't want anyone else to know. But what I read was enough to make me see everything in a different light. Apparently, my grandmother had once been in a position similar to mine. She, too, had felt overlooked and undervalued by her family, always trying to please people who expected too much from her. But as I read further, I learned that Madison's obsession with appearances and control went deeper than I thought. My grandmother had suspected that Madison might be acting out of a need to prove herself because she'd overheard something as a child, a conversation about the family's complicated history. She didn't spell it out in detail, but from what I gathered, there was some scandal involving our great-grandparents, a cover-up that had shaped the family's dynamic ever since. My grandmother had tried to protect the family image, but she worried that the way Madison was raised, with everyone treating her like royalty, had twisted her view of the world. My grandmother hinted that she feared Madison was becoming manipulative and entitled, and she left the house to me as a way of breaking that pattern. It was a revelation I hadn't seen coming. I'd always assumed my grandmother saw Madison as the family's shining star, just like everyone else. But it seemed she'd seen Madison's darker side long before I had. and she had decided to make sure Madison didn't inherit the house to avoid feeding her ego further. The weight of my grandmother's decision hit me hard. She hadn't just left me the house. She'd left it as a way of protecting the family, ensuring that the toxic cycle wouldn't continue. It made me feel more determined than ever to hold on to it, but it also filled me with questions. What exactly was the scandal she'd hinted at? And was there something else she hadn't shared that might explain why Madison felt so entitled? Just as I was processing all of this, I heard a knock at the door. It was Madison. Of course. She'd been coming by regularly, but this time she looked different. She seemed desperate, almost frantic, her usual calm, calculated demeanor replaced by something raw and angry. "Liam," she started, not even waiting for me to invite her in. "This has gone on long enough. You know this house isn't meant for you. It's mine. It's always been mine." I tried to keep my composure, but her words were like a slap. "It's not just about what you want, Madison. Grandma chose me. She wanted me to have it, and I'm going to honor that." She narrowed her eyes. "Honor? You think you're honoring her by stealing from me? This was supposed to be my legacy. They all know it." "Maybe they do," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "But Grandma knew you better than you think. Maybe she saw something in you that wasn't so perfect." That hit a nerve. Madison's face went red, and she looked like she was barely holding herself together. She took a step closer, her voice dropping to a cold whisper. "You don't know anything about this family, Liam. You never have." "Maybe not," I replied, feeling a surge of defiance. "But I know that Grandma wanted me to have a place where I belonged. And I know she didn't think you were the right person to carry on the family legacy." She scoffed, her face twisting into a bitter smile. "Fine. Keep your precious house. But you'll regret it. I'll make sure of it." With that, she stormed out, leaving me standing there, shaken but resolute. I wasn't backing down, no matter what she tried. This house was more than just a piece of property. It was a symbol of my grandmother's trust in me, a place where I could finally feel like I belonged. And I wasn't going to let Madison take that away. But as the days went by, Madison's threats started to materialize. She spread more rumors, telling people that I was unstable, that I couldn't handle the responsibility of the house. She even hinted that I'd pressured my grandparents into leaving it to me, a claim that anyone who knew me would recognize as ridiculous. But Madison was persuasive, and I could see people starting to doubt me. Every time I went to a family gathering or spoke to someone on the phone, I could feel the judgment, the suspicion. It was like I was on trial, and Madison was determined to paint me as the villain. In the middle of all this, I returned to the journal, hoping to find something that would give me more strength, more answers. And that's when I found a final entry from my grandmother, something that sent chills down my spine. She wrote, "To the one who reads this, I hope you understand why I made the choices I did. This house is a sanctuary, but it carries the weight of our family's secrets. Protect it and protect yourself. And remember, sometimes the people who seem closest are the ones who cause the most harm." Her words echoed in my mind, and I couldn't shake the feeling that she was warning me about Madison specifically. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that my grandmother had seen the potential for Madison to hurt the family, and she had left me the house as a shield against that. For the first time, I felt a strange kind of peace. I wasn't alone in this fight. My grandmother had seen everything, and she'd chosen me as the protector of the family's legacy. It was a responsibility, yes, but it was also a privilege, one I'd never expected to receive. With renewed determination, I prepared myself for whatever came next. I knew Madison wouldn't give up easily, but I also knew that my grandmother had given me the strength to stand my ground. The house was more than just a building. It was my inheritance, my place in the family, and my chance to finally find the belonging I'd always craved. No matter what Madison tried, I was ready to protect what was mine. And as I closed the journal and looked around the old house, I felt a strange sense of calm, as if my grandmother's spirit was right there with me, guiding me through the storm. Here's the fifth and final part of the story, titled Claiming My Place. Madison's threats didn't stop. If anything, they became more intense. She showed up at the house randomly, sometimes banging on the door late at night, other times simply lurking around the property. Each time, She'd repeat her line about how the house was hers and that I didn't belong. It was like she couldn't accept that my grandparents had truly chosen me, and nothing I said could change her mind. I kept replaying my grandmother's final words in my head, feeling like they were the only armor I had. She trusted me with the house, not just as a gift but as a shield against the damage Madison could cause. I had a responsibility to protect this place, for her memory and for myself. One evening, Madison barged in again. This time with a family meeting she'd organized without telling me. A few relatives were already inside, looking at me with a mix of pity and disapproval. It was clear she'd been talking to them, planting seeds of doubt and suspicion, and now they were here to see if she could break me down. Madison started her speech as soon as I entered the room. "Liam," she said, her tone full of forced calm, "we're all here because we're concerned. This house, it means so much to the family, and everyone agrees that it should stay with someone who understands that." The audacity of it was almost laughable. I wanted to ask where she'd been when my grandmother had written the will, but I bit my tongue. "Madison, I get that you're upset, but Grandma and Grandpa made their decision. I'm honoring their wishes by keeping the house," I said firmly. One of my uncles spoke up, clearly uncomfortable. "Maybe, Liam, it would be easier on everyone if you considered letting Madison live here. She spent more time with the family. It's her dream." Madison nodded eagerly, but I could see the manipulation in her eyes. She was waiting for me to crack, hoping I'd fold under the pressure. But I was done with that. "Actually," I began, feeling a surge of confidence. "I found something that might clear things up." I reached for my grandmother's journal, which I'd brought downstairs earlier, almost as if I'd sensed that this confrontation was coming. Everyone looked confused as I opened it to the passages that revealed my grandmother's thoughts about Madison and her intentions for the house. I read aloud, letting my family hear my grandmother's voice, her worries about Madison's behavior, and her wish for me to have a place to belong. With each sentence, the room grew quieter. Madison's face paled as I read the line about how the house should go to someone who valued it, not as a trophy, but as a home. When I finished, the room was silent. My relatives looked uneasy, glancing at Madison, clearly trying to process what I'd just shared. My grandmother's words had exposed a side of Madison they'd never seen, and it was like the scales were finally falling from their eyes. Madison was furious. Her face twisted, and she lashed out, her voice shaking. "That doesn't mean anything. She was just an old woman who didn't know what she was doing. This house is mine, Liam, and I won't let you keep it." I took a deep breath, standing firm. "You're wrong, Madison. She knew exactly what she was doing. And so do I. This house is mine, and I'm not going to let you take it." My words seemed to shatter something in her. She looked at the rest of the family, hoping for support, but the expressions on their faces had changed. They weren't on her side anymore. My grandmother's words had broken through her charm, revealing her for who she really was. She stumbled back, her hands clenched into fists. "You'll regret this, Liam," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Then, without another word, she turned and stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind her. For the first time, I felt a sense of calm. I'd stood up to her, and my family had finally seen the truth. It was a strange, freeing feeling, like a weight I'd carried all my life had been lifted. I realized that the house wasn't just a building. It was my place, my belonging, the one thing my grandmother had trusted me with to protect. In the days that followed, things finally began to settle. Madison stopped showing up, and the calls and messages died down. Some family members even reached out to apologize, admitting that they'd been wrong to pressure me. It felt strange, receiving their support after years of feeling like the outsider, but I accepted it with a sense of peace. I'd proven myself, not to them, but to myself. With Madison gone, the house became truly mine. I spent my days fixing it up, preserving the memories my grandparents had left behind. It felt like my grandmother's spirit lingered in every room, like she was there with me, proud that I'd finally claimed my place in the family. Looking back, I realized that inheriting this house wasn't just about property or tradition. It was about breaking free from years of feeling like I wasn't enough. My grandmother had seen that in me, and she'd left me something to hold on to, a piece of family history that was truly mine, something that no one could take away. For the first time in my life, I felt like I belonged, and I knew, no matter what happened, that this house would always be my home.